when freedom quietly became possible and nothing visibly prevented them from leaving. The prisoners found themselves standing still, not because they were forced to remain, but because moving forward suddenly felt more dangerous than staying exactly where they were, as if the absence of control itself had become something they no longer knew how to survive. As the days unfolded without resistance or command, the men began to sense that the boundaries surrounding them had changed in a way that was difficult to confirm, yet impossible to ignore, because nothing explicitly prevented them from leaving, and at the same time, nothing encouraged them to go. The fences still stood, the paths remained familiar, and the camp looked exactly as it had before, but the force that once defined every movement within it had quietly dissolved. They noticed the change first in small details rather than dramatic gestures. Gates were left unattended longer than usual, patrols passed without interest, and the rigid timing that once controlled every hour of the day began to loosen until it no longer mattered. Meals came late or not at all. Work assignments were mentioned and then forgotten, and inspections that once brought tension simply stopped happening. At first, the men reacted as they always had, continuing their routines by instinct rather than instruction, because habit felt safer than interpretation. They rose at the same hours, gathered in the same places, and waited for direction that never arrived, convinced that the absence of orders was temporary or deliberate, perhaps another test designed to expose those who moved too soon. But as time passed without consequence, the realization settled in that nothing external was holding them back anymore. There were no threats issued, no punishments prepared, and no visible authority waiting to intervene if someone chose to walk away. The freedom they had imagined for so long was suddenly present, yet it arrived stripped of context, meaning, and reassurance. This created a tension none of them had anticipated. Leaving would mean acting without permission, without shared understanding, and without the certainty that others would follow. Staying required nothing more than remaining within familiar patterns, surrounded by people who understood the same unspoken rules. In this imbalance, motion began to feel risky, while stillness felt reasonable. Some men approached the edges of the camp, standing near paths that led outward, studying the space beyond with cautious attention. They measured distance, imagined the first steps, and then hesitated, not because they feared immediate punishment, but because they could not imagine what would come next once the camp no longer shaped their decisions. Others watched quietly from a distance, observing these moments of hesitation as if they were evidence of something important. No one mocked those who lingered, and no one encouraged them either. The absence of reaction reinforced the sense that every decision now belonged entirely to the individual, and that responsibility weighed more heavily than confinement ever had. As the hours blended together, the men began to understand that freedom was not something that happened all at once. It did not arrive as release or relief, but as an open space that demanded clarity, initiative, and confidence they no longer trusted themselves to possess. Years of survival had taught them how to endure rules, not how to exist without them. By the end of this phase, it was clear that staying was not the result of fear alone, nor was it the product of force. It was the outcome of uncertainty combined with familiarity, a quiet choice made repeatedly because it required the least explanation. The camp remained full not because the men were trapped, but because leaving felt like stepping into a world that no longer offered structure, guidance, or protection. And so they stayed, not because they were unable to leave, but because freedom, when it finally arrived, asked more of them than they felt prepared to give. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. as the realization that nothing was actively preventing them from leaving settled more firmly into daily life. The men began to confront a problem they had never faced during captivity, which was the need to decide for themselves what leaving actually meant. Freedom no longer existed as a distant idea or a promised outcome. It existed as an option that required action, and action now carried consequences that were no longer defined by rules. During captivity, every movement had been measured against external authority, and survival depended on understanding limits imposed from outside. Now, those limits had blurred, and with them disappeared the familiar framework that once absorbed responsibility. Each man understood that if he chose to walk away, there would be no order violated and no punishment administered, but there would also be no guidance, no shared direction, and no certainty that the choice would lead anywhere safe. This uncertainty changed how the men perceived movement itself. Walking toward the edge of the camp no longer felt like escape, it felt like separation. The first steps away from familiar routines required commitment to an unknown path, one that could not be tested gradually or reversed without consequence. Leaving was no longer a physical act, but a psychological one, demanding confidence that had been slowly worn away over years of dependence on enforced structure. The men noticed that they were no longer asking whether they were allowed to leave, but whether leaving was wise. Some tried to reason through the situation carefully, weighing possibilities and imagining outcomes. Yet each imagined future seemed abstract and incomplete. Outside the camp lay a world reshaped by war, one they had not seen, touched, or understood in years. Inside the camp lay familiarity, shared experience, and a sense of order that, while limited, remained predictable. This contrast made staying feel less like surrender and more like caution. Small groups formed naturally, not to plan escape, but to discuss uncertainty. Conversations revolved around rumors, distant possibilities, and hypothetical dangers, rarely arriving at conclusions. Each discussion ended where it began, reinforcing the sense that waiting preserved safety while action introduced risk. In this way, hesitation became reinforced through shared doubt rather than enforced obedience. The absence of urgency further weakened the impulse to leave. There was no countdown, no closing gate, and no visible consequence for delaying. Each day that passed without change suggested that remaining was acceptable, perhaps even expected. Waiting no longer felt temporary. It began to feel like the sensible response to a situation that offered no clear advantage to immediate action. Some men tested the boundary of stillness by making small changes rather than decisive moves. They wandered slightly farther than usual, adjusted their routines, or spent time near paths leading outward, yet stopped short of committing themselves. These half-steps provided the illusion of progress without requiring resolution, allowing the men to feel active while remaining safely within familiar limits. Gradually, the camp itself began to feel less like a place holding them back and more like a place holding them together. The shared uncertainty created a quiet bond, one built not on hope or resistance, but on mutual hesitation. Each man recognized his own doubts reflected in the behavior of others, and that recognition reduced the pressure to act. If no one moved, then remaining felt justified. By the end of this stage, it became clear that freedom had introduced a new form of restraint, one rooted not in force or fear, but in the weight of responsibility. The men were no longer waiting for permission to leave. They were waiting for certainty, and certainty never came. In the absence of certainty, staying became the easiest decision to repeat, and repetition slowly transformed hesitation into habit, anchoring the men to a place they were no longer forced to inhabit, yet were increasingly unwilling to abandon. As the days continued to pass without interruption or resolution, the men began to notice that remaining in place no longer felt like a temporary pause, but like the default condition of their lives, something that required no explanation and invited no challenge. What had begun as hesitation slowly hardened into routine, and routine, once established, proved far more persuasive than any rule that had ever been enforced. They no longer approached the edges of the camp with the same frequency or intensity. Paths that once drew curious glances now blended into the background, their significance fading as familiarity reclaimed the center of attention. The act of leaving, which had once carried emotional weight, gradually lost its presence in daily thought, replaced by the quieter comfort of knowing where one belonged from moment to moment. This shift was subtle, almost invisible. No announcement marked it, and no agreement was made, yet behavior aligned naturally. Men woke at similar times, gathered in the same areas, and followed patterns that required no coordination. The shared rhythm of staying reinforced itself, making movement outward feel increasingly unnecessary and oddly disruptive. Remaining felt neutral, while leaving began to feel like an interruption of something stable. Those who still considered departure found it harder to imagine doing so alone. The absence of visible resistance did not eliminate pressure, it transformed it. Standing apart, even briefly, introduced a sense of exposure that few were willing to tolerate. Leaving the group meant leaving the shared understanding that had formed quietly over weeks of uncertainty. And that understanding, however fragile, offered reassurance in a world that no longer did. Conversations reflected this new reality. Men spoke less about what might happen beyond the camp and more about what had already been established within it. Discussions focused on maintaining order, preserving calm, and avoiding actions that might disturb the balance they had achieved. Without realizing it, they had begun protecting the very stillness that once unsettled them. What made this transformation especially powerful was how reasonable it felt. Staying did not feel like surrender because no one was forcing it. It felt like practicality, cooperation, and shared sense. Each man could justify remaining with logic that sounded convincing, especially when echoed by those around him. In this way, individual doubt dissolved into collective acceptance. The camp itself reinforced this behavior. Its familiar structures, routines, and spaces provided continuity the outside world could not offer. Inside, expectations were unspoken but understood. Outside, nothing was clear. The contrast grew sharper with each passing day, tilting the balance further toward remaining where life felt manageable. By this stage, the men were no longer waiting for freedom to begin. Freedom had already arrived and failed to compel them. What they were waiting for now was not permission or opportunity, but reassurance that leaving would not undo the fragile order they had built through shared restraint. In the absence of that reassurance, staying became more than habit. It became identity. The men no longer described themselves as prisoners, yet neither did they see themselves as free. They existed in a space defined by familiarity rather than force, held together by a collective choice that was never spoken aloud, but repeated daily through inaction. And as this pattern solidified, it became clear that the camp no longer needed walls or guards to keep its population intact. The decision to stay had been absorbed into daily life, turning freedom into something theoretical, distant, and increasingly irrelevant to the reality they now inhabited. As the shared decision to remain settled into daily life, the men began to sense that something new had taken shape around them, something quieter and more effective than the authority that had once controlled them. There were still no guards directing movement, no rules posted or enforced. Yet behavior within the camp had become remarkably consistent, guided by expectations that no one had formally established. They noticed it first in how easily order maintained itself. Men instinctively avoided actions that might draw attention, not from fear of punishment, but from an unspoken understanding that disruption threatened the fragile balance they all depended on. Voices remained low, movements measured, and routines preserved, even though no one demanded such restraint. The absence of enforcement made the consistency feel voluntary, which in turn made it harder to question. Observation replaced supervision. Each man became aware that his behavior was visible to others, not in an accusatory way, but as part of a shared awareness that encouraged alignment. A pause held too long, a movement that broke the established rhythm, or an action that suggested impatience was often met with quiet stillness from those nearby. These moments required no correction, because the discomfort they produced was enough to prompt self-adjustment. What made this system especially powerful was its subtlety. There were no confrontations, no punishments, and no explicit demands, yet deviation carried a cost that was immediately felt. Standing apart meant standing alone, and after weeks of uncertainty, isolation felt more threatening than conformity. Remaining within the shared rhythm offered reassurance, while acting independently introduced emotional risk. Over time, the men began to anticipate these reactions before they occurred. They corrected themselves preemptively, choosing actions that blended rather than stood out, and in doing so reinforced the very expectations shaping their behavior. The group no longer needed to respond to difference, because difference had learned how to disappear on its own. This created a calm that appeared stable and controlled. From the outside, the camp might have looked orderly, even peaceful, as though authority had returned in a gentler form. Inside, the calm was maintained through constant awareness, each man carrying a portion of responsibility for preserving it. Control no longer belonged to an external force. It existed everywhere at once, diffused across glances, pauses, and shared restraint. The most unsettling aspect of this transformation was how reasonable it felt. The men did not experience themselves as constrained. They believed they were being careful, considerate, and practical, unaware that these qualities were now serving the same purpose obedience once had. The system asked very little of them, only that they continue behaving as they had learned to behave, and that request felt entirely acceptable. By this stage, the idea of leaving had faded almost completely, not because it was forbidden or impossible, but because it threatened to disrupt a balance that now felt essential. Freedom no longer promised relief. It promised responsibility and isolation. Staying offered predictability and shared understanding. And predictability had become the most valuable currency in a life stripped of clear direction. In this way, the camp no longer required surveillance or force. It had become self-regulating, sustained by mutual observation and the quiet agreement that stability was worth preserving, even if it meant surrendering something that once seemed essential. And so the men remained, watched not by guards or walls, but by one another and by the expectations they had learned to internalize, proving that control does not need to be imposed when it can be quietly maintained from within. As the self-regulated order within the camp continued to hold without effort or enforcement, the men gradually discovered that remaining where they were no longer felt like hesitation, but like stability, and that stability had become something they were unwilling to disturb. Days passed smoothly, shaped by familiar movements and predictable interactions, and in this smoothness the men found relief from the strain that uncertainty had imposed on them earlier. Life inside the camp now required very little from them. They knew where to stand, when to speak, and how to move without thinking about it, because these patterns had been reinforced quietly through repetition and shared expectation. Each man could anticipate the rhythm of the day without consulting anyone else. And this predictability removed the mental effort that freedom demanded. In contrast, the world beyond the camp remained undefined, filled with choices that had no clear answers and responsibilities that could not be postponed. Leaving would have meant abandoning this fragile sense of balance. To walk away would require stepping into a space where no shared rhythm existed, where decisions would have to be made alone, and where failure would belong entirely to the one who chose to act. For men who had spent years surviving through obedience and adaptation, this prospect felt overwhelming rather than liberating. Some still paused near the edges from time to time, standing quietly as if testing the idea of departure rather than the act itself. These moments rarely lasted long. The farther they imagined themselves from the routines that now organized their lives, the more exposed they felt, as though leaving would strip away the only structure that remained reliable. Staying, by contrast, demanded nothing dramatic. There was no commitment to make, no declaration to announce, and no risk to accept. Each day of remaining simply flowed into the next, reinforcing the sense that nothing urgent required action. The longer the men stayed, the more natural it felt, until the idea of leaving seemed less like a choice and more like an unnecessary disruption of a system that was working. What made this stage especially powerful was how easily it justified itself. The men told themselves that waiting was sensible, that conditions might change, and that clarity would eventually arrive. In the meantime, maintaining order felt responsible, even virtuous. They were not refusing freedom. They believed merely postponing it until it made sense, unaware that postponement itself was becoming permanent. By this point, the camp had transformed into something unfamiliar. It was no longer a place defined by captivity, yet it was not a place of freedom either. It had become a refuge from decision, a space where expectations were clear precisely because they were unspoken, and where life continued without demanding courage, initiative, or risk. In choosing to remain within this structure, the men did not experience themselves as surrendering anything essential. They experienced themselves as surviving intelligently, preserving stability in a world that offered no guidance. Freedom still existed beyond the camp, but it had become abstract, distant, and emotionally costly, while staying felt concrete, manageable, and safe. And so the camp endured, not because it held them back, but because it asked less of them than freedom did, proving that the strongest barriers are not built from fences or force, but from routines that quietly convince people that leaving is unnecessary, even when nothing stands in their way. In the end, nothing dramatic sealed the decision to remain, because there was no single moment when freedom was rejected or confinement was chosen. Instead, staying became the natural outcome of countless small hesitations, each one reasonable on its own, each one postponing action just long enough for routine to take its place. What began as uncertainty slowly transformed into acceptance. And acceptance settled into a life that no longer demanded explanation. The men did not feel trapped because nothing was actively holding them back. They did not feel liberated either because liberation required a kind of certainty they no longer possessed. Between these two states, they found a fragile balance that allowed days to pass without confrontation, without risk, and without the burden of deciding what came next. Freedom had arrived quietly and without instruction, asking for initiative, responsibility, and courage all at once. In contrast, the camp offered predictability, shared understanding, and relief from choice. Faced with this contrast, remaining felt sensible, even wise, while leaving felt unnecessary and strangely dangerous. No guards needed to return, and no gates needed to close, because the camp no longer relied on force to remain full. It endured through habit, through familiarity, and through the quiet human tendency to choose what feels manageable over what feels uncertain. And so the story does not end with escape or defiance, but with stillness, leaving behind an unsettling truth that freedom, when offered without preparation, can lose its power to pull, while the comfort of routine, once internalized, can hold people in place more effectively than any wall ever could. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.